How's it going, everyone? The 1MFP here. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're healthy. I hope you're staying safe. Today I bring to you this 9th installment of me reacting to Hua Chenyu performances. This time around I'll be reacting to 7 personalities. It's the performance I got the most requests for since my last Hua Chenyu reaction, which was to Sacred Tree. If you missed that reaction or any of my prior Hua Chenyu reactions, you could find them all in one playlist that I have linked down below in the description box. But without further ado, let's get right into this one. 7 personalities, Hua Chenyu. ，Sweet little lullaby turned metal.
《 多么美，星星都坠毁，漆黑我像浮冰中丢了一块多刺眼的空白，不停地在懊悔，直到迷失自己。
This guy's range is incredible. Oh man, I'm at a loss for words here. Whew, okay. I gotta say, I kind of forgot how good Hua Chenyu is at switching things up in one song. You know, he just starts in one place, takes it to another place, and then brings it back to where he began, and he could just take it in so many different directions and keep it all coherent. And that's exactly what we got here with Seven Personalities. It kind of reminds me of how I felt about Nunchucks, where, I mean, that was my introduction to Hua Chenyu, actually, a Nunchucks performance. And just his ability to switch between these various sections that were so distinct and, you know, they had their own feels, you know, like they weren't easy to segue one into the other, but he found a way to make them just go fluidly together. And he just has the ability to put a song together in that manner, you know? It's absolutely incredible. I really like the instrumentation here and the way he uses that to alter the feel of these different sections. One that really stood out for me was the use of the acoustic guitar to take care of the mid-range frequencies for you know, the more softer parts, whereas when he transitioned into that more hardcore metal part, we transition into the electric guitar really taking over at that point. But beyond the guitars, there's so much going on here to create distinctions between the different sections, from vocal delivery to lighting to drumming patterns. It all made for an erratic feel, and it really felt like by the end of the song you really reached that boiling point, and Hua Chenyu did a great job of demonstrating that visually through his dance and through the screams. You know, he really built up to this point where the lights were kind of just flickering like crazy. I found it really interesting how Hua Chenyu managed to pull that off and how he used his ability to transition seamlessly between styles within the same song to really help push that point across, you know, to push that feeling of erraticness. So it's part of what I really enjoyed about this performance. And I feel like the lyrics really play into that as well. So without further ado, let's get right into that. The song starts off as such. Night befalls and insects chirp, seeing a robin in the sky fly by, the sparrow outside the window, for whom does it mourn? Now the thing to take into account here is the song starts off as a bit of a lullaby before transitioning into something different where he delivers the for whom does it mourn line. That's when we transition into more of like a rock sound, you know, something a little bit heavier, or maybe not a little bit, definitely heavier. The drums get more intense, we have the presence of a heavy electric guitar sound, and then we have this shut up line. So the contrast we see between the introductory lines and how he chose to deliver those lines versus what followed immediately after, I think it really sets the tone for how we listen to the rest of the song. The sound itself is a big component of that as well, you know, just the very sweet sounding, innocent sounding introduction into the more heavier sound. So that's something I just want to keep in mind as I go through these next lines here. If all time is unrecorded, left not a trace behind, if all ancient books turn blank, how could the past be portrayed? If a man can tamper with his cruel and sullen fate stamped at birth. And then we transition into, I guess this would be the chorus, and that's where he uses a Sanskrit mantra. Now, I will say the use of a Sanskrit mantra at such a distinct moment in a song like this that does have very distinct sections to it is something that influenced the way I heard this song. And what I mean by that is, you know, you really have this buildup where we ended on the shut up line where, you know, it was that harder sound, and we transitioned into this softer section that is the verse. And in the verse, in terms of instrumentation, we have a gorgeous acoustic guitar riff, whereas just before that, in the harder section, it was, you know, that heavier electric guitar sound with the more intense drumming pattern. But then also in this verse, we have this staccato delivery, but he ends off each second line or so on legato, and it makes that word really hit you, and it gives you time to ponder about what he just said, whereas all the staccato delivery really builds up the tension up until you reach that point. So that really helps him build this feeling of tension up to this point, where he builds up to this line about if a man can tamper with his cruel and sullen fate stamped at birth. That line is kind of what he uses to transition into his chorus. And now once you do get to this chorus where there's the chant of a Sanskrit mantra, you kind of get brought to the idea of what a Sanskrit mantra is really for. And I mean, from my exposure to it, I've seen it used in yoga, I've seen it used in meditation. I know it has origins in various religions. Buddhism and Hinduism come to mind. But from how I understand Sanskrit mantras, they serve this purpose of allowing your mind to disconnect from a perceived reality, from the physical realm, in order to allow ourselves to focus or hone in on our inner selves. And in turn, that can allow us to connect with a more spiritual side, with some introspective thoughts that may not arise if you don't really give them the space to arise. So with that in mind, it puts this song into a certain perspective for me. And that perspective is, if we go back to the beginning of the song where we have that defined contrast, you have the description of something that, especially with the sound of how it was described, it feels like it's something that should be positive and pleasant. But then we're led into something more negative immediately with the shut up line and the who does it mourn when we're talking about the robin. So what I see there is somebody who can be put in a situation where, you know, they're faced with something positive, but the things that they've gone through and the things that they've seen and the things that they're experiencing is not allowing them to see this scenery in a positive way. You know, their experiences have altered their vision of those things. And then when we're led into the main verse part where we do have those staccato lines that really build up the tension up until we get that legato ending. We have, if all time is unrecorded, left not a trace behind. If all ancient books turn blank, how could the past be portrayed? In my mind, we're getting a depiction of why this person we got in the introduction is where he is. And the way I interpret this occurrence here is, if all time is unrecorded, I feel like this person feels like they're doomed to make the same mistakes over and over again. Or he may be talking about it in more of a broader context where he's talking about how humanity is doomed to make the same mistakes over and over again, just in different contexts. If all ancient books turn blank, how could the past be portrayed? What I'm getting out of this is that over time, the truth gets buried. You know, we could talk about recording history through books and records, but how we interpret what's written and how we read into what's in the records is going to be altered over time. That's going to vary on what we know, and it's also going to vary based on conflicting information. You know, we're going to have information from one period and information from another period, and it may not align so seamlessly, and at a certain point things may get confusing, and when things get confusing it leaves room for interpretation. And that's where this all time goes unrecorded line really lingers with me. As much as we could try and record time through these different means, there's always going to be room for interpretation, and the more distance we put between the past and the present, the more that interpretation can be faulty through all the interpretations that are being made and through the influences that they have on one another. And to bring that into the final line before we transition into the verse, if a man can tamper with his cruel and sullen fate stamped at birth. Now, with this line right here, I feel like we're back to this theme that I mentioned in my prior Hua Chenyu reaction, which was Sacred Tree. It's something we saw in Child as well, I believe, and it's the things that we do not have control over. It's the environment that we find ourselves in, the ways in which that environment shapes us. Much like there's this unknown with what the past really is, there's this unknown with who we are and what makes us who we are. At this point in the song, I get the sense that he feels that he's in a negative place, and he's trying to identify why that is. He feels that potentially circumstances have put him where he is, and he is doomed to be where he is because of that environment he found himself in at birth, and because of the world he was born into and the realities that came with that. Now, following the Sanskrit mantra, we have the epic delivery of these lines here. Ancient, present, heaven, earth. When the great chaos first dissipated, clarity, turbidity, black and white are distinguished. Dwelt upon the vast heaven and earth, birth specks of dust, ecstasy, anger, joy, sorrow, flourish and decay in endless cycles, right and wrong, victory and defeat, alternate, hundreds of mundane life forms in eons of samsara, the eternal, the bygones, the existing, the unknown. So I gotta say, I really enjoyed when he delivered these lines here, because if there was one thing the sound told me, it was that we were getting contrast in this song. From the beginning, where we had that contrast in the introduction, up until we had the buildup of tension that then led into the Sanskrit mantra chorus, where we're kind of releasing that tension, then led into this portion of the song here, where we have that contrast really delivered line by line. Ancient, present, heaven, earth. It's like we got this sense of contrast through the sound, and it was very satisfactory when he delivered that through the lyrics in a clearly defined way. Now, with that contrast explicitly mentioned here in this section, and with it also including the mention of a cycle, this section here has a sense of foresight and clarity to it. We talk about good and bad, right and wrong, clear and blurry. We're talking about extremes and how over time we fluctuate between these extremes. And to me, it feels like the person who was talking in the beginning kind of came to this understanding that whatever they're experiencing right now, be it the circumstances or the environment they find themselves in, those circumstances won't always be the same, and the same holds true for the environment. And furthermore, their perspective on these things can change over time as well, whether it's the circumstances or the environment. So to me, it's like they've identified layers of what they're experiencing. There's what they're feeling, there's what they see, what they can observe, and there's also what's actually happening. And on both ends, what's actually happening can change. What they're feeling can change. What they're seeing can change. And it can all vary based on a multitude of things. But above all else, what holds true right now in the present at this moment is not necessarily going to hold true at a future point in time. And that gives a different perspective on what we were talking about earlier with respect to, time turning pages and those pages turning blank. Reality is a very complex phenomenon, and how we choose to define that's going to vary from person to person. But I would say what's important for me in this song here is that our perception is a big part of what we consider to be reality. And with that in mind, how can we put ourselves in the shoes of somebody else to experience what they're experiencing? And furthermore, how can we put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who pre-existed us or something that pre-existed us. We can't experience these realities. We are confined to ourselves and our own experiences. We have our own mistakes to make, and we're going to learn through those mistakes. As much as we could learn from other people's mistakes, there's a limit to that. So what I get out of this section here is that there's good in the bad and bad in the good, and how our perception is going to affect our reality. And, that thought, I feel like it gives hope to the person here in this song. It gives hope to the individual that we see leading into the next section of the song. So let's get right into that. From antiquity to future ages, prosperity eventually fades. All things bloom with a single move of my thought. The chaotic cosmos transforms in thousands of forms. 'Tis none other than this, 'tis none other than this. Let me dictate, up to me to dictate. All shall vanish, and only leaving that completely unrestrained self who stands in towards storm and does not hide. Bearing uncongealed wounds, I dash to the battle on the verge of losing control for the final escape. For snatching back the lost freedom, I am willing to turn into a beast. So here we start off this section talking about prosperity fading. So we have that negative side of things, but then we have an immediate contrast with something positive, talking about all things bloom. And what I find interesting about that here in this specific section is we have the involvement of the individual within that, and how they brought about that positivity, because we're saying all things bloom with a single move of my thought. The way I hear that within the context of what I heard earlier on in the song with respect to the loss of control and how he seemed to feel doomed to a certain fate based on circumstances, it feels here like he gets this sense of hope from the sense of control that he feels he can have still through his ability to be mindful about his perspective on things. So here, when he finds himself in a storm or in a negative space, as we may have seen earlier on in the song, he's going to stay in this mind frame where he's going to keep fighting, where he's going to keep dashing forward, where he's going to keep trying to get himself out of the position that he currently is in, if it's not one that he wants to be in. And the reason for that may be that as much as he may not be in control of certain things, he realizes he has control over other things, and it's important to focus on those things. To not focus on those things to him would mean giving up. It would be giving up that influence that he could potentially have to the chaos, to the lack of freedom. So when we have those ending lines of this section about snatching back the lost freedom, the way I hear it is he's trying to, escape this negative space, and he's going to do so by focusing on the things that he can control, which more or less is going to be his perspective and being mindful about his perspective. If he could do that, he could have enough influence over himself and his thoughts and his circumstances to kind of push away the things that he doesn't control as much, or maybe not push them away, but have them have less of an effect on him and his position. But definitely one thing to take note about in how he ended this section is what he's willing to do to stay true to that. He talks about dashing to the battle on the verge of losing control. He talks about his will to turn into a beast, and he delivers that line with a very climatic feel. When you take those things into consideration, you get this real feel that he's in the heat of the storm, he's battling, he's trying to take control of his life the most he possibly can, and he's gonna stop at nothing to do so, to the point where he's willing to self-destruct. This matters to him to that extent. But then following that climatic point, we end up in this next section, which leads us back into the gorgeous guitar riff that is a lot smoother than what we were hearing previously. If the truth is entirely buried, no words are uttered. If men could accept succumbing to these predestined sullen fates, and then we're back into the chorus. So at this stage, being brought back into this type of sound and with this type of delivery, I get the sense that we're referring back to this idea of a cycle here. And having ended in the previous section on a very climatic point where, he's trying to fight for his freedom to a point where he's willing to sacrifice so much. It feels like he could be brought back to this point where he could feel a loss of control again and a lack of influence on his circumstances and his life. What really brings me to this perspective is the way in which he's talking. You know, in the previous section, he was talking about himself and getting himself out of a situation, out of the storm, fighting for his escape, fighting to regain his lost freedom. Overall, this came about from some introspection. But now here in the following section, he's back to talking about the world and observations he's making externally. And whenever he does get back into those external observations and those external factors, it seems that he gets that sense of a lack of control and a lack of freedom back. But after that, we're led right back into the chorus with the Sanskrit mantra, which then leads us into the outro, where we have "When tranquility arrives once more, oh, how beautiful is this scenery. Even stars stumble and perish in pitch blackness like a puzzle. I have lost the peace with such glaring blankness, endless ruin till I have completely lost myself." What really struck me about this section here is the very first line, "When tranquility arrives once more." So to say "when tranquility arrives once more," first of all, you're saying that tranquility was once there. So that's something to take into account. But to say "when" as well, they're predicting that tranquility has to arrive once more. So despite them being in the storm, despite them being in a negative mindset, despite them experiencing negative circumstances, they know that it has to pass. Positivity eventually has to come around. And then to follow that up with, "Oh, how beautiful is this scenery." It's like in going through the negative, he has more appreciation for the good, you know? And beyond that, he has deeper perspective coming out of that situation. He's learned more, he's got more wisdom. That wisdom allows him to observe that it's all a cycle, you know? Something that may seem eternal may not be eternal. So, you know, that's when he references the stars. But then he also has a line like a puzzle, I have lost the piece with such glaring blankness, endlessly ruining. It's like coming out of that situation, as much as he has an appreciation for things, he also feels like he lost a certain part of him. You know, maybe it's a certain innocence that he had, maybe it was a certain belief he had. It's as much as he grows from experiences, he feels like he's also losing parts of him through experiences. And through that, there's this buildup of regret, and he ends on "until I have completely lost myself." And that's where we have this really epic buildup where he starts screaming and he dances erratically, and he does that basically until his song ends and until he drops to the floor. So it's definitely a very animated ending to the song, and like I said, there's definitely a lot of buildup here. And there's a lot of ups and downs, and that's something we get through the subject matter of the song as well, through the lyrics. We seem to be able to observe him be in a negative space, but be able to take himself out of it. And we kind of see how, through what types of thoughts, he's able to get himself out of that space, and we're able to see how that allows him to transition into a different mind space. But then we also see him dip back into the negative a little bit, and we see how that transforms him over time. And I mean, it's pretty incredible how we're able to see that all in one song, how all of that was able to fit in one song. But overall, what I heard in this song is we have a representation of an individual and the different versions of themselves based on where they find themselves between the two extremes, whatever the two extremes may be, depending on the circumstances. So we kind of see how their thoughts shift based on their placement between those extremes. And through that struggle, we see the ways in which their thoughts shift. We see the ways in which their personality shifts. We see the ways in which they grow. We see the things they lose. So that's what I gather out of this song here. That's how I heard it. I found it really interesting. I find that there's a lot that was packed into one song here. It's extremely interesting. It's very powerful, and the performance really added to that. The way in which the music was arranged was very beautiful, and the ways in which all the different elements of this song and performance and visuals, the ways in which all of that complemented each other really added to the overall experience of watching this. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. And that's what I thought of this song and this performance. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments down below. You know, I always love hearing what you all have to say. Please leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it. I always appreciate the support. And I will see you all next time. Have a great day, y'all.